there's a new dodgy Cold War between the United States and Russia. The Western elites are secretly very grateful for what the Russians have done over the last 100 years. Russia has been such a formidable enemy and threat that it provided the justification for a massive US military budget, a massive array of military bases in foreign countries, the NSA espionage system, the formation and expansion of NATO, and the globalization towards a world government. All this would have been unthinkable without such a huge, scary enemy in the East. Nowadays, only a few people in the anti-New World Order movement today actually seem to remember the works of Anthony Sutton, how he meticulously documented the ways in which large Western corporations actually delivered everything that was necessary for the Russians to build a modern infrastructure, to build an empire. But what happened after the Cold War? Well, Western elites had struck a secret deal with the Russians in the mid-1980s, a few years before the fake surprise fall of the Soviet Union. The Russians argued at the time, hey, we are broke and we need a lot of loans from the West and we need access to Western markets and we need investments from the West. If we don't get that, Russia will fall apart into many different pieces and we would lose control over the many former Soviet satellite states such as Ukraine. Imagine hundreds of republics where there used to be the centralized Soviet Union, each controlling nuclear weapons. Very hard to control, very hard to globalize. So the Russians got what they wanted. In return, the Western globalists got what they wanted. Russia remained a centralized dictatorship. It maintained a large degree of control over the former Soviet republics. And overnight, the Russian military budget shrank by 96% because Russia was broke. If the Western globalists had wanted to do so, they could have initiated a full-on attack a few years later, exactly when most of the Russian nuclear weapons had been dismantled, decommissioned, or had aged very badly. If the Western globalists really considered Russia to be the arch enemy, they would have created any kind of pretext and launched a surprise attack against Russia. But that didn't happen. Instead, the West helped to rebuild Russia and the Russian military. The West didn't complain much when the Russians invaded Chechnya. The West didn't complain at all when the Polish presidential airplane with the Polish elite on board crashed on Russian soil and the investigation was a sham. The West didn't complain much about how Moscow still maintained control over the former Soviet republics. Between the end of the Cold War in 1991 and the beginning of the Ukrainian crisis in 2014, the Russians were pampered. During that time span, NATO had lost its biggest enemy. Its biggest excuse to spend insane amounts of taxpayer money. The CIA had lost its biggest excuse for secret missions around the world, and the NSA had lost its biggest excuse for even existing at all. Sure, the war in the Balkans in the late 1990s delivered some excuse to get involved, but only 9/11 really gave way to a decade's worth of warfare. So, the United States milked it for all it was worth, fought two of the weakest countries on Earth at the time, Afghanistan and Iraq. Both countries could barely muster any fighter planes or any meaningful tank units. And then you had Al-Qaeda, the umbrella name for a flurry of jihadist groups in the world. Al-Qaeda never had an air force or tank battalions, but somehow the Western propaganda went ballistics and told us we needed more surveillance than during the Cold War, and we needed to lose more freedoms than we had during the Cold War, and so on. As if a simple insurgency group was as threatening as the Soviet Union, or even more threatening. Now the Islamist threat lives on in the Islamic State. But all that focus of NATO on asymmetrical Islamist threats only provided the necessary recovery time for the Russian Empire. The Russians quietly rebuilt their empire while the world was looking at the military adventures of the United States. Many people below a certain age in the alternative movement, conspiracy movement, critical thinking, whatever you want to call it, described 9/11 and the years that followed as their awakening experience. So they watched a ton of documentaries, read books and articles, but still, they only received a limited perspective. There's more than one aggressive empire in the world. All these empires employ the same despicable practices and techniques. And all these empires need each other as a counterbalance. Without a big enemy, they would fall apart. It's like in the fictional world of the novel 1984, where you have three large empires in a state of perpetual war against each other. But they all need each other to maintain their dictatorships. It's never explicitly mentioned in the book, but these empires are described in a way that suggests they might even be working together at the top. In the real world, you've had a lot of Russian agents of influence who infiltrated the conspiracy movement, and they just applied the formula. They endlessly attacked the United States, the US government, but they never attacked the empires of the East. They were, in fact, advertising the empires of the East. No matter what happens at any place in the world, these agents of influence will immediately blame it on the West, even in those cases when it makes no sense. When a prominent critic of the Kremlin like Boris Nemtsov gets killed near the Kremlin, those liars will immediately claim the CIA killed him. If terror attacks happen in Russia and Putin benefits, the liars will immediately claim that a CIA conspiracy was to blame. This has become so common that it has severely damaged people's ability to think clearly, to judge facts, to investigate an event, and to understand geopolitics. During the old Cold War, leftists in the United States and Europe praised the Soviet Union. They claimed it was a workers' and farmers' paradise, when in reality it was hell. When the communists invaded Vietnam, the leftists in the West were cheering. When the United States got involved, those same leftists got very angry and accused the United States of cruel imperialism. The US soldiers on the ground really wanted to fight this scary enemy. But behind their backs, the Western elites sold all kinds of factories and goods to the Eastern Bloc. Off-road capable vehicles and trucks, electronics, ball bearings, anything. Even Henry Kissinger, who became known as a big mass killer of communists, helped along the Chinese communist state. The Cold War was a sham. Anthony Sutton even described in his books how Western elites made it possible for the Chinese to become an economic superpower. Sutton predicted this precisely. So, with all this history in the background, we have to analyze the events starting in 2014 with the Ukrainian crisis. Ukrainians had actually voted in the 1990s to become fully independent of Russia. This is what the people wanted. And the West made promises to Ukraine. You give up your nuclear weapons, and we will protect your independence. In reality, the United States and Russia had a secret deal that said Russia will maintain control over Ukraine. It's an easy kind of deal to make. You control this part of the world, and we control the other part of the world. So why did suddenly a new Cold War break out? What's the point? Why don't the four empires in the world, US, Europe, Russia, and China, simply merge and form a world government? Scary prospect. The US and NATO gave the necessary time and help to the Eastern Bloc to grow into big scary threats during the last 25 years. And even longer, of course. And suddenly the West acts as if it can't make a backroom deal about Ukraine, a slab of backcountry in the east of Europe. Suddenly the West acts all angry and starts cutting all that help they gave to the Eastern Bloc in the last 25 years. The sanctions dry up Russian money. Suddenly the West remembers it can produce cheap oil themselves, and suddenly the oil price drops so low that the Russians lose money on the one thing their economy is based on. Suddenly the Russians uncouple their currency from the fixed exchange rate system with Western currencies, and the Russian ruble does a dive bomb. And so many educated Russians with means are fleeing the country. The government will soon have to close the borders, like in the old days of the Soviet Union. Russia already has a state-run economy, but soon they will have to use slave gulag labor again, like they did in the past, and just like China still is doing today. There will be no way around this. This is what is happening today. Same goes on with China. After decades of help from the West, the help is running out. And suddenly the Chinese markets are collapsing. Suddenly nobody in the West believes the Chinese statistics anymore. The head of Goldman Sachs recently said, "I'm not investing in China anymore, and I don't recommend that anybody else does." Now, as you may know, ladies and gentlemen, as you may know, China does hold a lot of US debt. But the Chinese were only allowed to do so because that stabilized the Chinese currency and kept it artificially cheap to make Chinese exports more attractive. All that help is running out. And the Russians and the Chinese have to stand on their own feet now. We're approaching the end of the Made in China era. Modern style robotics and 3D printing will bring China into a very, very difficult situation. Very difficult to maintain this empire and this dictatorship. So, after decades and decades of help from the West, of this welfare, the empires of the East are now starting to stand on their own feet. And they desperately need a big war in order to keep the dictatorships going, to stabilize. This could be a Cold War. This could be a set of proxy wars. Could be a world war. Maybe the United States is provoking the East. Maybe this is all part of a larger plan for united world government. Whatever the end game is, we should never ever get into bed with any of these empires. Don't fall into the trap and think Russia and China are acceptable dictatorships and friends. This new Cold War is a sham. Imagine what you would do if you're living in Western Europe or you're living in the United States. Imagine what would you be saying and doing when Russian nukes hit the United States, hit targets in the US and in Western Europe. What would you do? What would you say? Would you celebrate? Would you celebrate that liberation? Would you celebrate this as a liberation, just as the left would have celebrated something like this during the old Cold War? How long would you celebrate this before Russian troops or Chinese troops land in California and start making their way across the country? So, this was a short explanation of this new Cold War, which is a sham, and We will explore that topic further in further videos. I've actually written a book on this in German, and there's a lot more to it, and there's a lot more source material to demonstrate how serious this is and what that means. Now, none of these empires really trust each other. No matter what kind of secret deals they have, they always try to backstab each other, and none of this is any good. So the next time you hear somebody saying, oh, we need these Eastern empires as a counterbalance, be very, very careful. Because these dictatorships need enemies, they need these as counterbalances. And if it wasn't for these enemies in the East, we'd have a much, much better chance of defeating Western globalism. Thanks for listening. You can find us at recenter.org, and please like this video, please comment and subscribe.